Hello, Internet. Daniel with Driving and Dragons here today with a quick reaction video. I'm going to take a look at old Double D and how to handle evil PCs at the RPG table. Wanted to kind of move away from some of the news of the day type stuff just because it gets kind of irritating. So much of it really doesn't matter at all to most of the tabletop role-playing game world. It really only matters to those of us who are more invested in it than just people who like to play games and throw dice. So every now and then it just kind of grates on you a little bit. So we're going to move away and talk about handling evil PCs at the table with good old Double D, see what we agree and disagree with him. 280ZX, the clutch lines are on the menu for today, and it may possibly bleed over into doing some fuel pump work and a couple other things, just depending on how long this one runs. I will say that on top of that, there was a Critical Role whiskey that was announced here recently that I found out about today. Not that I have any love for Critical Role, as anybody who's ever listened to me knows, but one thing that I do love is I love whiskey. And even though it might drive a little hate from the crybabies and the pearl clutchers to have a channel that is about cars and driving and Dungeons and Dragons, and then do something that has to do with liquor, I was kind of wondering if anybody would have an interest in, even maybe, though I try to stay away from live, maybe even a live tasting or just a tasting review of some of the tabletop RPG themed whiskeys that are out there, because there are a few. There's a company, I think it's called the Found Spirit Distillery. I'll have to look that up again. They did the Critical Role whiskey that's coming out at the end of this month, and they also did they have one that's called Paladin and Paladin Plus One and Quest End and a few others that are all tabletop role-playing game and fantasy themed whiskeys, and might be fun to grab a couple bottles and do some nosing and taste testing and reviewing on here if anybody'd have an interest. If you would, let me know in the comments section below. But moving forward, without further ado, we're going to step up and take a quick look at Double D's how to handle evil PCs at the table.
The ability of decent people to continually describe awful things is probably limited at some point, don't you think? Have you ever had a player whose character went rogue at your table? Well, not just rogue, but purposely evil. Evil of their own free will. Or maybe they wanted to play an evil character right from the start of the game. Now, this has only happened at my table a handful of times, maybe twice. And I'm not sure about you, but back in the day, it seemed the license to cause mayhem wasn't necessarily any of the evil alignments. It was actually chaotic neutral that caused most of the issues. I'm
not meaning to cut him off in the middle of the sentence there, but that's absolutely true. I'm actually somebody who's run a lot of actually evil campaigns and vile campaigns. I was very pleased in the 3rd edition days when the Book of Vile Darkness came out and my group ate it alive. And as a player before that, I want to say that 90% of the campaigns I played in were evil PC campaigns. And I will 100% agree with old Double D here that, yeah, chaotic neutral to this day, I find to be the worst of the players, because everybody knows that my soapbox is alignment, that's what I get up on and just go to town and rant about the most. And chaotic neutral, like most alignments, are pretty well misunderstood because most players just do not take the time to understand the mechanic and how it's supposed to work and how it's supposed to work within the game world. And they take chaotic neutral to mean I can just do whatever the hell I want, whenever the hell I want, with no repercussions for anything. Just, this is how I can be crazy town. That's not what chaotic neutral is. Chaotic neutral, they take chaotic neutral to be my character is a character in a video game, and I can just woohoo, so random, do whatever the fuck I want to, whenever I want to. That's not what it is. that has nothing to do with it. Chaotic neutral is just somebody who is predominantly focused on personal freedom, and they are neither driven or compelled to help others as somebody who is good, nor are they driven or compelled to harm others as in evil.
Not sure why, but for a time, maybe even still, there'd be horror stories from tables with a chaotic neutral character or group of characters that were just acting like complete idiots. It was sort of like I can do anything I want with no personal consequences. But look, I'm not really evil. But I digress. It has led to a larger question, one that came up recently on Twitter. What is acceptable at the table and what is not acceptable as far as, well, overtly evil acts? Realistically, it's probably a battle between player agency and the DM's will to continue to describe, potentially horrible things. First of all, we as DMs are all conditioned to describe our worlds based on a combination of real life experiences, what we read in books, and what we see on TV and in the movies. I think it's safe to say that for the most part, when we sit down to play a fantasy RPG like D&D or any of the much better choices available these days, many of us are working from a common set of morals or at least tropes. Your character doesn't need to be Dudley Do-Right. He or she can be the man with no name. The group can be the Dirty Dozen. But in the end, when the forces of darkness are gathering, most of us assume that they're going to firmly step on the side opposite that of the darkness. But I'm sure there are groups where the PCs either don't care or perhaps might even want to assist that darkness. And for me, a lot would depend on, how close they're coming to being absolutely evil, in terms of my willingness to run that sort of game.
Okay, so that's not a bad way to kind of step up and say it. It is, like you said, the biggest problem with chaotic neutral is just people who seem to think that means there's no consequences for their actions and that they can do whatever the hell they want to, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, we all do kind of come from a collective sense of morals. Even the people who try to be the radically amoral, intentionally transgressive people are intentionally transgressive because they know what to transgress. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be transgressive. The people who go out of their way to be offensive know it's going to be offensive because of that collective social moral. And I'm perfectly okay running a mature, evil, vile campaign. However, and this is with anything, has nothing to do with safety tools or lines and veils or any of that kind of crap. But you still have to understand that there is a level of common decency. And when one player or the DM, who is the player, obviously, or even all the players, start crossing into the grounds where they are legitimately making people uncomfortable, not just in a gaming sense, but also in a personal sense, where they carry that effect away from the table with them just because of how far somebody goes. That isn't playing a game. That isn't simulationism. That isn't realism. That's not immersion and getting into the game. That's just being an asshole. That is just like the people who are transgressive purely for the sake of being transgressive. And we've all seen that situation, either on video or in person, where somebody comes out and they keep pushing the line, and they keep pushing the boundary, and they keep pushing the boundary, and then somebody backhands them across the face, and they want to sit there and cry about like they didn't expect it. And everybody looks at them and goes, well, you peed on the corpse at a funeral. What did you expect to happen? You had to know this was going to happen. Of course, that's obviously a ridiculously over the top example, but you get the point. You get up there and you start talking about how some deceased woman was a whore, prostitute, and a terrible person and a horrible mother or something at their funeral. And then you expect people to feel sorry for you. You're talking about, oh, you assaulted me. You assaulted me. You're going to go to jail for this. How dare you? I can't believe he did that, when the son, tackles you into the choir box. Same thing happens at the tabletop role-playing game table. When you're at the D&D table and you got somebody who just wants to keep pushing things, eventually the players are going to get up and be like, you know what? I didn't sign up for this. DM's going to get and say, look, we're immediately fading to black. We're not going to cover that because we're not here to play out whatever weird, crazy rape fantasy you have. And by the way, you're not coming back to the next game. This is why it's very important that if you're going to run evil, everybody has to know what they're getting into. And there has to be that unspoken understanding that everybody at the table is still going to be a decent human being in the real world while they're playing this very not decent person in the game.
All right, so let's circle back a second. I've been running a weekly game on average for over 30 years straight. 25 of that has been with more or less the same group. It's not only a gaming group, but it's a group of friends and family. As a DM, I can tell when some members of the group are maybe going through stuff in their real life because it does present itself in how they play or even how they build their characters. It's not often talked about, but in a close-knit group, what's going on at home has an impact at the game table. As a DM, it's incumbent on you to present the world the players are playing in. And I do believe that once you sit down with the players, you owe it to them to describe the things that occur in that world, even if you may think they are distasteful and bloody to you personally. Now, you don't have to go into nauseating detail, but if actions in the game lead you there, you should at least acknowledge it. And once in a while, those sorts of things can have a memorable impact. But the problem is anyone drawn to playing just sort of a despicably evil PC might try to keep topping what they did before, just leaving a litany of acts more depraved than the last. I mean, not only is it distasteful, but it starts to lose its impact. That's why I would worry about a player or even a group that wants to go full evil or chaotic neutral all the time. It might be an indication that there's something going on in their real lives. In the end, it's going to leave your game fairly boring after a while too. In other words, most evil campaigns, they just seem unsustainable to me. The ability of decent people to continually describe awful things is probably limited at some point, don't you think? And I bet it begins to sap their creative energy. Wizards of the Coast dabbled in this area back in 3rd edition when they printed the Book of Vile Darkness by Monty Cook. And while it had a few interesting things in it, there's a reason it's not much remembered these days. It's certainly not a classic, and it has stuff in it that might be good for a dalliance, but would just seem to be silly to implement fully. Now keep in mind.
Well, kind of funny because these just went through two things that I mentioned earlier. One, there's a difference between we're going to play evil characters and have evil motivations and evil driving characters who behave in a certain way, and that person who's just being transgressive, who's always pushing the envelope to do one awful thing after the other. That's where it goes back to being an ass. And he kind of touched on something that's actually very important for running any kind of evil game, in my opinion. Evil campaigns and evil games generally should not be the kind of thing you play at the game store with a pickup group, with an online group that you've been with for a few months. Evil games, as a general rule of thumb, are the kind of thing you play with groups of people that you know very well, groups that have a very well-established dynamic where everybody has kind of settled into a familiarity with each other, where you can understand when somebody says something that they wouldn't necessarily mean, and you're not going to attribute some of those factors back to the person as opposed to just the character, where you can understand that, such as understanding that just because an author can write a truly despicable character does not mean that that author themselves is truly despicable. those are very important for playing those, especially when I say a Vile game. It's, because you brought up the Book of Vile Darkness, which I use incredibly, like, frequently. I've worn the cover off of my copy, and I've literally used it in the game I'm running right now, the 3.5 game that I'm running on Discord right now. I've literally used the Book of Vile Darkness and monsters out of it. But the thing about the Book of Vile Darkness is, even if you're using it to craft villains and whatnot, it generally talks about things that are too far for most tables, especially most tables that don't have a long and storied history. And like I said, I find it to be extraordinarily useful. And I don't think it necessarily disappeared into the annals of history because it's not a classic or because the players didn't want it. I think that it may be one of the earliest examples of something like Dark Sun, where Wizards of the Coast decided that they didn't want to play in that sandbox anymore because of just the sensibilities and the potential of offending players, because there's some pretty nasty stuff in the Book of Vile Darkness. And I don't really think you should normally use all of it, but the Priest and some of the other classes, some of the other concepts that are in it, the portfolios on the Archdevils and Princes of the Demons are, to me, phenomenal work and phenomenal, very useful things for crafting epic campaigns, because as that book says, truly epic and glorious heroes need truly evil villains to face. So I kind of disagree with him on that front, but let's see what we have to say.
When I'm talking about PCs going evil here, I'm really talking about the truly evil things, mostly sort of harm of varying degrees to women, children, if you get my drift. But there are areas that come up that do fall into that gray zone. And one of them is torture, which is something that I think many groups probably do come across at some point. I always think of that scene in Dirty Harry where he's trying to rescue a 12-year-old girl who's been kidnapped and is dying. And he has the suspect, Scorpio, trapped on the 50-yard line of Kezar Stadium. He begins to torture Scorpio to find out where she is. Needless to say, almost everyone who watched that movie probably sided with Harry. After all, we knew the person he was torturing was a complete monster who deserved it, especially in the face of a dying young girl. Have your PCs ever done something like that? Have they ever tortured an orc or perhaps a fellow human because they ran out of options to find out key information where lives were at stake? In this case, I think there's a clear difference than what we were talking about earlier. The PCs are going over the line, perhaps, but it's not gratuitous, and it's in the service of the story. And the DM is free to throw in consequences for their actions, too. In that Dirty Harry movie, the police do find where Scorpio has imprisoned the young girl. Harry's torture worked. But tragically, she has already died. And not only that, because Harry did torture the suspect to find the information, he can't be prosecuted and is now free to offend again, which he does. Again, this is how you handle these things in a mature, logical, and maybe even tragically poetic way. Another thing that comes up in fantasy games is slavery. Almost always it's, of course, the bad guys that own slaves, and I think it's well within bounds to portray a world where that sort of thing happens. It doesn't sugarcoat a society where, well, labor is desperately needed and nefarious people are going to try to take the easiest path to achieving their goals. It gives the PCs a chance to intervene and perhaps even find a way to attack a villain using that system of slavery against him. The only ones who have a problem with incorporating this issue are the ones that think slavery began and ended in the United States, when, of course, it does go all the way back to biblical times and continued in eras that a lot of fantasy worlds take their core from. Hiding from the issue sort of sanitizes things and also takes a tool out of your big bad guy's bag. Wizards of the Coast recently and sneakily changed the language in the online versions of their rulebooks. In one change in the monster manual, the Ifriti go from owning slaves to now owning servants. This is ludicrous on many levels. When you kill an Afridi, are you killing the kindly master of those servants? Will they get mad if you kill him? And if he treats them like 9-to-5 employees, is he all that bad?
Maybe he's got a dental plan.
Dental plan.
Lisa needs braces.
Dental plan.
Lisa needs braces.
Dental plan.
Lisa needs braces.
These are the types of idiotic things that can happen when you actually try to whitewash the world and get rid of evil altogether.
I mean, he's absolutely 100% right on that. I've said it before. The worst thing that the woke just snowflakeism that comes out of Wizards of the Coast, the worst part of it is not the stupid stuff like the wheelchair dungeons and the pandering. It's not the attempt to gender bend everything under the sun and the rewriting of old lore to fit some kind of stupid DEI thing. It's not the bastardization of like the deck of many things. That is all up front. We all see it. We all get the outrage about it. But it's the more subtle, insidious things that are worse. Like he said, when you start sanitizing the evil to make it less offensive, you go from fighting epic battles against great evil to fighting a guy who's kind of a jerk and probably doesn't deserve to have a halberd shoved up his ass for whatever he's doing, because he's no longer doing anything that's evil. It's just kind of wrong. And it really it leads to the kind of nonsense where the moral quandary that players have is, should they really be fighting the orcs? Nobody has a question about should you be fighting the orcs when they're taking slaves, burning villages, slaughtering women and children. Nobody has a problem with killing all the orcs then. But when you suddenly make the orcs just like the guy who is a little bit rude and, shoved you on the ground to take your seat at the tavern, all of a sudden chopping his head off seems like a gross overreaction. And you just get this kind of world where you're questioning everything you do. You're not sure about anything, and your characters don't get to have any conviction because the players can't have any convictions.
It just becomes boring in the other direction. In the end, choosing an evil act in the cause of what's seen as a greater good to me is far more interesting than a PC or a bunch of PCs who just want to murder unarmed people because, they can. I would not have much interest in running a full game like that. And fortunately, the folks I play with don't really want to play that way either. If you have a group that wants to get really evil, I suppose in the end, it's up to you to decide whether that's something you have the fortitude to run. But I would certainly think it through. You might be in for a bit of a rocky road. On the other hand, don't get preachy when your PCs cross a line they think they need to get the job done. There is a difference, and they don't need you moralizing to them about it. Just handle the situation as you would any other, and think if there's any consequences that may or may not arise from their actions. That's what you owe them. Well, that's all for today. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, remember to throw a like on it. And if you like the cut of my jib, go ahead and subscribe with those notifications on.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first off, definitely like and subscribe to Double D, because Double D is awesome. Diversity in Dragons, one of my favorite channels, even though he does a lot of live streams. And I tend to avoid live streams just because sitting around listening to people talk for hours on end about Dungeons and Dragons sometimes gets a little bit out of hand for me, especially with some of the live play stuff. I have no interest in watching other people play, but I do skim a lot of his live streams because his stuff's really interesting. I will touch on a couple of things. There's one piece of alignment gameplay that is really kind of highlighted by this. And that is like when he talks about crossing the line and having that evil act and there being consequences, and you're doing the evil in service of good. All right. As I've said before, alignment is a 1,000-yard stare, big picture view. It is not you did something evil, you automatically lose your alignment, unless it's something really, really significant. So when you really test their alignment, now if you test their alignment and every time you test their alignment, every time you give them a minor thing, it's like, oh, go straight to torture. Nuh-uh, that's when you're losing your alignment. But these big things where he has to cross the line, it comes into how far does the character cross the line. So like in the Dirty Harry situation, does he stop when he finds out where the girl is? Does he focus on things that cause pain but not significant harm? Does he do more threatening and less actual harming? Or does he find out where the girl is and then keep pulling toes off and start shooting parts of the guy's leg off? Does he continue beating the dude for no reason? Does he ask nonsensical questions and just for an excuse to do more? What, did it cross the line that is you're now doing an evil act? Or did it cross the line to where it's like your character has snapped to the point where maybe an alignment change or at least a threat to their alignment is necessary? And as a DM or a GM, you should not halt the character there. You might warn the character a little bit, but you don't preach to them. You don't argue them. You don't say you wouldn't do that. You don't argue forcefully against their actions. You might just say, hey, don't you think that might be going a little far? And even that may be too much when it comes to DM interference in their action. So it definitely has a place. And I would say to Double D, you should run an evil campaign. Run it with that great group that you have. Just because the campaign is evil, just because the characters are truly evil, does not mean that they should run around doing truly despicable and awful things all the time. Remember that evil in Dungeons and Dragons is predominantly about being selfish and self-serving and taking shortcuts and not caring if others are harmed if the result is something that is perceived to be beneficial to you as a character. It is perfectly, you can very easily have an entire evil campaign where you don't really do anything different than what happens in a good campaign. It's just the motivations are different and the methods and the reasoning are. The big thing you get is there's almost always going to be PvP in an evil campaign because there's going to come a time where it is more advantageous for a player to take action against one of their party members for gain, depending on what it is. And to me and to my party, when I was running a bunch of evil games and when I was playing in a bunch of evil games, in a lot of cases, what it came down to was truly despicable and evil things, even in vile campaigns. Truly despicable and evil things were either A, background continuous things, such as my character is a cannibal and he has human meat with him. We don't really go into how he harvests the meat, just like we don't go into how the ranger hunts deer for jerky for the rest of the party. Or he's a drug user and he's high on a regular basis, and it just so happens some of his drugs have benefits and whatnot, so I might use them before a combat or before watch or something to pick that advantage. But it's just generally like, hey, when we go to town, I'm going to go get high, or I'm going to go score drugs, or I'm going to go find the whorehouse because he's a sexual deviant or whatever. It's not really described. It's all background flavor information. Or the truly vile things were rare situations where it was literally, there is such a gain from this that I am okay going that far over the line because I just don't care. But the evil people generally, unless you're playing some kind of like raving psychopath, generally are not just doing super depraved evil stuff for the fun of doing super depraved evil stuff, because that's not any more realistic than anything else. Like it's just not a realistic way to play your character. So if you're going for simulationism, you kind of need to. Even truly horrific serial killers in real life had other things about them that you wouldn't recognize. Like John Wayne Gacy did kids' parties and ran a local KFC as a boss that everybody loved and had a little, construction business and was considered a pillar of the community. just so happened he did some extremely vile things on the side. If he were a D&D game, his extremely vile stuff wouldn't necessarily be something that was acted out. So anyway, that's what I've got to say on evil characters. I think Double D's got a lot of good points, but I think he may be a little biased against it. Not for a bad reason. And it's not like there's anything wrong with not wanting to go there. If your party's not interested, they're not interested. But you let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe. See you guys next time.